Representative Valerie Longhurst, the state's House Majority Leader, said the hope for residents to receive the money before June 30th. So this is nice news for Delaware residents. And also, people in Maine can now check the status of their $850 relief payments using a new website from the Maine Revenue Services. The checks, which will be paid for with $730 million from an estate surplus, were approved by the Maine legislature this past season as a one-time payment to help with the rising cost of inflation. The Department of Administrative and Financial Services says it mailed initial $5,000 relief checks via the U.S. Postal Service. Those are expected to arrive in mailboxes as early as this week. The department will then issue around 200,000 checks per week after that, with the vast majority of qualifying Mainers who have already filed their 2021 Maine tax return expected to receive their check by mid-July. Eligible Mainers should expect to see their checks arrive this week, and the state says it will be based on when your 2021 tax return was received. And while the tax deadline has passed, it's not too late to file a return. Mainers have until October 31st. The relief payments are also available to retirees and to those who receive Social Security and SSI, so long as they meet the eligibility criteria. With widespread student loan forgiveness has not yet become a reality, some U.S. borrowers have already received some debt relief. Roughly 1.3 million borrowers have seen $25 billion in student debt forgiveness since President Biden took office. The Department of Education announced it will discharge the outstanding federal student loans of former college students. In total, $5.8 billion in loans will be canceled for 500,000 borrowers, making it the largest single loan discharge by the Education Department. The Federal Reserve's analysis found forgiving $10,000 per borrower will result in roughly 11 million borrowers and slightly more than 30% having their entire balance eliminated. If the Biden administration were to move forward under this plan, an estimated $321 billion in federal student loans will be forgiven. The Education Department has also confirmed it is working on new regulations that will permanently improve a variety of the existing student loan relief programs, significantly reduce monthly payments, and provide greater protections for students and taxpayers. Now, new stimulus payments have been approved, but this is a new type of stimulus check that will go out to a targeted group of Americans. These checks will be worth $350, so watch until the end to see how to receive this. Democratic governor nominee is proposing $350 checks to help people in Ohio manage the rising cost of gas, groceries, and other essentials. But with some economists pointing to federal stimulus as one of the drivers of inflation, her plan may not sit well with them. The plan would take the $3 billion in America Rescue Plan dollars earmarked for Ohio and hand it out to residents directly. Checks would go to the same people who receive federal stimulus checks, $350 per individual or $700 a couple. And she argued that these rising costs are especially difficult for those living on fixed incomes. And while inflation remains high, many of those who oppose federal stimulus checks now argue that spending fueled rising prices by flooding the market.
The question I get asked a lot, as if I could have the answer and have a crystal ball, is how much lower could this go? So I'll ask you, the expert, from a strategy standpoint, how much lower could this go?
Hi, Dom. Look, it's a really tough question to answer. What we can say is that we think that there will be further declines from here. We're not going to stop at the 22% mark. Remember, a lot of these declines have taken place without actually seeing any drop in the earnings growth numbers. So this is almost your first leg so far. And then as we start to see the economic data, the earnings growth data start to turn, that's when you get into your second leg of equity market declines. And I wouldn't say that 30% drop from the peak is impossible.
So the 30% we've already gotten in certain parts of the market, right? The NASDAQ specifically, down more than 30% at this point from its record highs. If you talk about the broader S&P 500, you're still mentioning the same mega cap names, but it's a broader based measure. How much of this loss, hypothetically, if it can go to 30%, hypothetically, will be driven by that mega cap tech trade, which has already been destroyed, but now comes down to some of the more value-oriented sectors that have been leading the way, so to speak? I think of oil and gas in particular.
Yeah, it's a great question. So what we have seen, as you said, the NASDAQ really comprised of those really mega cap names has dropped very, very significantly. But remember, coming into this year, they were also the most overvalued. So the most expensive stocks will inevitably fall the furthest when you have this kind of macro environment. Now, the question of whether or not these companies are almost cheap enough to be attractive. Well, look, there are some names certainly within there which would be attractive. This is the time when already stock pickers start to perform well. But the overall sentiment of rising interest rates, a difficult recovery where demand is falling, especially given that large cap stocks have significant revenue exposure outside of the US. And actually, as weak as the US economy is likely to be, it's other parts of the world, such as Europe, emerging markets, which are likely to have.
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
I'm here on the floor today to talk about Postal Service reform. We have another vote this afternoon, and this is incredibly important to the people I represent and all of us represent. It's important because the Postal Service is something people depend on for so much. This legislation that we're talking about has been in the works for years. It's a bill to try to save the post office from insolvency. And if we don't act on this, I believe in the next few years we'll be back here with a big bailout for the Postal Service because they're having a tough time financially. The combination of this legislation that we will pass and some internal reforms that the post office is making should be enough to get the post office back on track. The Postal Service has a Postmaster General right now who is absolutely committed to that, making the post office more effective, more efficient. But he needs a little breathing room, as he says, and that's what we're doing here in Congress. It doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. And by the way, if we don't do this in a few years, it would cost the taxpayers a lot in terms of a bailout that I'm afraid would happen. And the post office, again, is so important. It's definitely worth saving. Our country is pretty divided right now, let's be honest. But one enduring reality about our country is that we have a post office that ties us all together. And everybody depends on that post office. By the way, it's been that way for a long time. In 1775, 3 months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, so this is 1775 before the Revolution was finalized in 1776, during that time, the delegates to the Second Continental Congress appointed Benjamin Franklin as the Postmaster General. And why was this so important? You know, Franklin was one of the founding fathers, and this was considered to be a really crucial post because the new Postal Service offered a way for the colonists to talk to each other, to communicate, for revolutionary leaders to be able to strategize with each other outside of the official British channels. So the post office has that rich history, and it continues to bind us today. In Ohio, it ensures that veterans get their medications, that they get through the mail, and believe me, that's important to them to get it on time. It allows absentee voters. In Ohio, we have no-fault absentee. We've had it for years. It works well, but it requires the post office to do its job, and obviously to not just deliver the absentee forms, but to get the ballots in on time. It also is crucial for people to be able to get their rent check in, or to be sure that they get their utility bill in time. It's for people's financial statements from their banks. But also, the post office still delivers birthday cards, thank you notes, personal letters that strengthen the bonds of family and friendship. So our Postal Service binds us together at a time when we're increasingly